Assalamu alaikum. One thing that puzzled the Muslims in MPAC, who've been campaigning for years, is why was it that Muslims were so unwilling and defeatist? Why was it that they were refusing to actually stand up and defend their own rights whenever there was a campaign? Why is it that they were so full of reasons why they couldn't do it? How could a community that any community, allow itself to be murdered, oppressed, bombed, tortured, jailed without trial, demonized the way the Muslims had been, but fail to react in any meaningful, organized way? If you ever ask the Muslims to do anything, and anyone who's actually, ever organized anything to try to get the Muslims active to do something, you would find that the Muslims would always come up with, at first, excuses. Then after that, they would question whether it was Islamic or not, or why it was pointless to do. And finally, having found that, they would end up even attacking the person asking them to do something. What was it? What psychological issue was going on within the Muslim mind? What socio-economic factors were at play that made the Muslims so slave-like, so passive, so afraid almost, so unsure, underconfident of themselves? How could it be that those who were the most religious outwardly, those who prayed in the morning, those who often preached, those who wore Islamic clothing, went to numerous Islamic classes or studied under scholars, were often the very people who were least likely to have done any real action in defense of the faith? How could it be that those people who were actually advocating Islam were the last to actually defend Islam? Those who talked so much about the Muslims and how we should look like a Muslim were the least to actually defend the Muslims when they were oppressed or in danger. And what we found was that the centers of learning, of Islamic learning, simply were devoid of that aspect of Islam that activated the Muslim. All the things that might pacify them were taught to even the smallest detail. But the areas that defended them, which were the highest, the most important, and the greatest rewarded areas of Islam, that defended Islam and defended the Muslims, they were almost absent from the teaching. If you went to a mosque, you would never hear about why Muslims needed to defend Islam and the Muslims, or how. You would go to an ISOC, again, they would never teach this. And the bookshops, go into any Islamic bookshop and you will hardly ever find a book on how Muslims should defend Islam, what is the rewards of it, how great a deed it is it ordained, is it farad, is it sunnah? None of this was explained to the Muslims. So what happened was that the Muslim mind, the more Islamic it went, the more involved it was on minor issues over the major. They could simply, they had no idea of how to actually react to a threat. When their brothers were jailed, it wasn't anything to do with Islam. There was no answer within Islam. When their sisters were raped or Muslim countries were bombed, again, they had absolutely no way of dealing with it because it was nothing to do with Islam. They were not taught any aspect of Islam that woke them up, that made them realize that there was a danger. And if they were awake enough to know there was a danger, there was no aspect of Islam that ordained that that was God's command that they react and do something about it. So they simply carried on sleeping, thinking that that is what Islam was, a pacified religion of inner rituals and selfish, inward-looking, worshipful deeds. Imagine a police officer who, instead of combating crime and stopping people murdering or thieving, instead focused on what clothes he was wearing and how shiny his buttons were. If that's all he was taught, well, that's where he'd spend 98% of his time, because he would have no idea of what actually to do. Why he was even a police officer, it wasn't to combat crime, it was to ensure that he wore the right clothes and he saluted the correct way and knew the books that had been taught off by heart. That is exactly the route a Muslim had gone. He knew nothing of what he was actually here to do in the world and what was the highest deed to defend Islam, justice, and bring about justice on this earth. He was simply here to make sure that he wore the right clothes and looked a certain way and practiced a certain number of rituals. Now, the reason why mosques, ISOCs and bookshops and all of the scholars that taught Islam failed to teach an Islam that taught the Muslims to stand up and defend themselves was simple. When the West occupied and destroyed much of the Muslim lands, these colonists ensured that anyone who actually talked about resistance, anyone who stood up and said, Muslims, don't take this, don't stand pacified while your lands are stolen and while your brothers are murdered, was jailed or killed. They knew very well that to have Muslims talk like this was simply a recipe for resistance, and they were not going to allow any resistance. So the Muslims then, the scholars then, and the mosque said, well, we don't want to be jailed, we don't want to be killed, so we will teach everything in Islam, but that the Muslims should get politically awakened and that they should somehow stand up for themselves. Of course, there was a few that did it, but they were small in number. So when Islam developed during that time, that there was no need to defend yourself because it was too dangerous too. Now, hundreds of years went by and nothing changed. As we landed on the shores of Europe and continued to be demonized and oppression started all over again, what happened was that the Muslims had become pacified. They were no longer teaching Islam where Muslims had any knowledge that they needed to defend themselves or what was ordained in the Quran and the various hadiths to defend ourselves. What they failed to realize, however, is that in the West there was political resistance. One didn't have to actually break the law to make real change. One could really resist, show the government's actions as immoral, as disgraceful, and undermine the fact that the government's propaganda was simply a lie. And this act of resistance, this act of standing up against this type of propaganda war was an act of resistance in itself. It was a political act. Imagine Malcolm X, when he stood up, he didn't use a gun. His words were enough to destroy the very basis of the racism that was used against the black man. And yet the Muslims had no understanding of this type of resistance. They simply thought that resistance meant on the battlefield in Palestine or nothing at all. Just pray for them or do dua, which was something almost alien to Islam. Well, the West then used propaganda to ensure that fear continued within the Muslim mind and grew. Every day you heard of terrorists and hate preachers. Anyone who spoke up against oppression and against the Western foreign policy was a hate preacher and was radicalizing the youth. And you saw so-called Muslims then come out and start to demonize and claim that anyone who spoke of Muslims resisting this type of oppression was in fact radicalizing the youth. They never taught the real truth to the non-Muslim, which was that killing, slaughtering, occupying, destroying the lives of, torturing millions of people was the real root cause of terrorism, and it was nothing to do with hate preachers. They sidelined it. They hoodwinked the public and claimed it was anyone who spoke about these issues that was in fact radicalizing the Muslims. It was a lie. It was a fabrication. But in fact, a fabrication that took root and was used by the government because it was an excellent cover. The government didn't want to tell the public why Muslims were rising up and resisting them. They simply wanted an excuse that could demonize them and allow them to carry on further to their barbaric foreign policy. But Muslims were incompetent in challenging that narrative. They were incompetent in doing anything. In absolutely all fields, the Muslims were almost pacified as the demonization and the attacks continued. In the media, the Muslims simply had no competency in how to deal with it. When it came to parliament, they simply voted in MPs that were demonizing them and attacking them, having no strategic understanding that they should remove the MPs that were attacking them and put in place those who were willing and able to defend them. Even on the internet, I remember a very interesting conversation I had with a Muslim strategist, and he said to me, you know, the millions of Muslims now are on the net and they can put forward the truth to the non-Muslim about what's really going on. And yet, even here, it seems that the Muslims are outgunned, unbelievably, because they are so passive. Instead of teaching other Muslims, you know, how to wake up and what they could practically do, or the non-Muslims of what is really going on and how they've been lied to, the Muslims took to the net and either pacified again with endless, pointless debates over minor issues, as if this was all Islam consisted of, and it was the most important thing that everyone knew, that women should not wear nail varnish, or that you should not wear leather socks more than 3 days. Or on the opposite side, they simply failed to use the internet at all for any useful purpose at all, apart from mindless minutiae. So it didn't matter how the enemies attacked the Muslims refused almost point blank to stand up and do anything. And yet, if you asked them to wear a certain garment of clothing and said this was the sunnah, they would do it. The mosques refused to be centres where the Muslims could be organised. So if Muslims were jailed without trial, the mosques really had no competency and were completely, again, unwilling to organise helping them. Even if we couldn't save, for example, Baba Ahmed, we could have at least helped their family. We could have at least raised the plight of people like that around Britain. But it had to be done in an organised way, in organised centres. The mosques refused to do this. Again, it was no different from ISOCs and no different from bookshops or any centres of knowledge. If Muslims were attacked in the street and there was rising Islamophobia, where was the reaction from the Muslims? Again, the Muslims simply did nothing. Whereas if any of this had happened to any other community, the non-Muslims would never have allowed it. So until we change the way we think, until we change the prioritization of the Muslim community, the way that they prioritize Islam itself, until the hubs of education, whether that be the mosque, whether that be the ISOCs, whether that be the bookshops, whether that be the scholars, start to prioritize Islam and teach the most important aspects of Islam, the defense of Islam, the defense of the Ummah, the defense of the oppressed, justice, we would always be an enslaved community, unable to react against the greatest threat Islam and the Muslims had ever faced since the dawn of Islam.